They had just settled into their new life in a quiet Arkansas town. Clinton and Cristen Brink, with their two young daughters, were the epitome of the loving, outdoorsy family chasing a dream of new beginnings. On Saturday morning, July 26, 2025, they waved goodbye to their neighbor and drove to Devil's Den State Park. For them, it was an escape, a place of natural beauty, far from any hint of danger. They walked into the peaceful Ozark forest with their children, completely unaware that a monster was already lurking in the shadows. But just hours later, the silence of the woods was shattered, not by the sound of wildlife, but by a chilling, panicked call to emergency services. At 2:03 p.m., the radio traffic crackled to life with a single devastating alert: possible assault, parents missing, 2 children at the scene. Imagine the terror of the first responders racing through the dense, silent trails. They were not just looking for victims, they were hunting for a ghost. One officer radioed back, his voice strained. "I can hear yelling, calling for help." But the calls soon faded. The peaceful park had swallowed the sound. They were getting closer, but they still didn't know what or who they were about to find. What unspeakable horror had just unfolded in that quiet corner of the forest, and was the monster still there? By the time authorities reached the lower trails of Devil's Den State Park, silence had already reclaimed the forest. The wind cut through the trees with an eerie stillness, the kind that follows chaos. What they found was a scene of unspeakable violence, the remnants of a family outing turned massacre. Clinton and Cristen Brink were gone, their lives taken in what should have been the safest place imaginable. Just hours earlier, it had been a perfect Saturday, the kind of day made for laughter, fresh air, and family photos. But as the sun began to set behind the dense Arkansas woods, that perfect day twisted into a permanent nightmare. The question that echoed across the park and through every investigator's mind was the same: why them? When Major Stacy Rhodes of the Arkansas State Police arrived, she would later describe what she saw as one of the most heinous scenes we've ever had. Blood pooled along the dirt path, the remnants of a violent confrontation that seemed to make no sense. This wasn't a targeted hit or an act of revenge. It wasn't even a crime of passion. It was something far more terrifying: random, senseless brutality. A family had simply crossed paths with a monster at the wrong moment in time. Officers quickly realized their priorities had changed. First, to find whoever had done this. Second, to protect the 2 young children, the Brink daughters, who, by what could only be called a miracle, were left physically unharmed but emotionally shattered. They had seen everything. They were the silent witnesses to a horror no child should ever endure. As news broke, the story of Clinton and Cristen Brink spread beyond Arkansas, capturing national attention. The more the world learned about them, the more unbearable the tragedy became. Clinton was a quiet man, a nurse aide and delivery driver known for his humility and kindness. He had a reputation for going the extra mile, the kind of man who'd show up early to help a coworker finish their shift. Cristen, on the other hand, was full of energy, a registered nurse, brilliant and compassionate, the kind of woman who seemed to have endless reserves of care. She'd earned degrees in both nursing and mathematics, all while raising 2 children and keeping her faith at the center of her life. Together, they were each other's anchor, a team built on love, laughter, and simple joy. Friends said the Brinks had recently moved to the quiet town of West Fork just weeks before the attack. They didn't have much, but they had hope, a new beginning. A friend once said, "Cristen always had an extra hand for somebody else." And in the cruelest twist imaginable, that same selfless instinct would define her final moments. Witnesses near the Devil's Den trails recalled seeing a man, average build, wearing a long-sleeved shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark pants, a baseball cap, and fingerless gloves. He was walking alone, expression unreadable. Investigators urged the public to check their photos, dash cams, and hiking videos, desperate for a clue. But one detail stood out above all: the suspect's vehicle, a black 4-door sedan, possibly a Mazda, with tape covering the license plate. That single piece of evidence screamed premeditation. This wasn't just a drifter who snapped. This was someone who came prepared to hide. The manhunt began immediately. Helicopters hovered over the park as K9 units scoured the woods. Every nearby road was monitored, and residents were warned to lock their doors. Detectives worked around the clock, piecing together security footage from homes, gas stations, and park entrances. The case gripped the state, a random act of savagery committed by someone who seemed to vanish into thin air. Then came the revelation, the heart-wrenching details of the Brinks' final moments. Investigators believe the attack began with Clinton, who was fatally stabbed first. But what happened next transformed Cristen from victim to hero. Instead of running, she secured her daughters, ensuring they were hidden and safe. Then, with unimaginable courage, she turned back toward the chaos, toward her dying husband and the armed stranger. She faced the killer head-on, an act of pure defiance that cost her her life. Cristen Brink died fighting, protecting the family she loved. Even in death, she embodied everything good and selfless that evil can never touch. 4 days later, a break in the case came from surveillance footage near the park. The same black sedan, its plate still covered with tape. Investigators traced the vehicle to a suspect, James McGann, age 28. He was arrested at a barbershop in Springdale, calm and cooperative, as if nothing had happened. When tested, his DNA matched blood at the scene. The manhunt was over, but the fear had only begun. Who was McGann? Not a career criminal, not an escaped convict. He was a former elementary school teacher, the kind of person parents once trusted with their children. But as investigators dug into his past, the story turned darker. His teaching record was erratic, full of resignations and quiet removals. At one school, he had been investigated for concerns related to classroom management, professional judgment, and student favoritism. One parent recalled a disturbing comment he allegedly made to a student, a young girl. He had told her, "If you were older, I would love to marry you." Chilling words that hinted at something broken, something festering beneath a polite surface. It was as though the man had lived his life on the edge of a line, never quite crossing it publicly, but always circling something monstrous inside him. When he finally did cross that line, 2 innocent people paid the price. By the time authorities reached the lower trails of Devil's Den State Park, silence had already reclaimed the forest. The air hung thick, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of insects. The afternoon sun had started to fade, spilling a red haze across the treetops, the kind of light that turns beautiful places sinister. What they found on that quiet path was a scene of unspeakable violence. 2 bodies. A young couple, Clinton and Cristen Brink. Just hours earlier, it had been the kind of Saturday families dream of. Sunshine, laughter, the smell of pine and earth. But by the time the first responders arrived, that perfect day had become a permanent nightmare. There was no warning, no clear motive, just chaos frozen in time. The question that hung in the air, unspoken yet deafening, was why them? Major Stacy Rhodes of the Arkansas State Police would later describe what she saw as one of the most heinous scenes we've ever had. The trail told the story before the witnesses did. A struggle, desperate, violent. Blood scattered across the dirt. A picnic blanket abandoned mid-laugh. And 2 small children standing just beyond the carnage, too shocked to cry. The Brinks' daughters had survived, untouched, but forever changed. This wasn't a targeted killing. It wasn't revenge, or jealousy, or greed. It was something far worse, a random act of savagery, the kind of horror that makes no sense, that tears apart the illusion of safety. Authorities knew their priorities immediately: find whoever did this and protect the only 2 witnesses left alive. As the story broke, the public learned who Clinton and Cristen Brink really were, and that knowledge only deepened the tragedy. Clinton was quiet, soft-spoken, a nurse aide and delivery driver who worked 2 jobs but never complained. His co-workers called him dependable, humble, the guy who made life easier for everyone else. Cristen was the opposite in energy but equal in kindness, a registered nurse, radiant and ambitious, with a mind as sharp as her heart was big. She had degrees in both nursing and mathematics, had played volleyball in college, and still made time to volunteer at her church. Together, they were raising 2 little girls in a small town, starting over, finding peace. They'd moved to Westfall just weeks before their deaths, a town of 7,000, where doors still stayed unlocked and neighbors waved from porches. Friends said the Brinks didn't have much money, but what they did have, they shared. Cristen always had an extra hand for somebody else, one friend said. They were the embodiment of goodness, faith, love, and small-town hope. Then, in an instant, all of that was stolen. Witnesses who'd been hiking near the same trail described a man, average build, long-sleeve shirt rolled to his elbows, dark pants, baseball cap, fingerless gloves. He'd been seen near the lower path around the time of the attack, expression blank, eyes distant. Investigators urged anyone with photos or videos from that day to come forward. But one clue stood out, a black 4-door sedan, possibly a Mazda, with tape covering its license plate. It was a chilling sign of forethought. Not a spur-of-the-moment explosion, but something premeditated, calculated. The search for that vehicle became a race against fear. Detectives combed through every second of surveillance footage within miles of Devil's Den. Gas station cameras, traffic lights, neighborhood security systems, all scanned for the same dark car. Meanwhile, helicopters cut across the sky above the park. Officers went door to door. Locals slept with lights on. The man who had done this could have been anywhere. And then, slowly, the Brinks' final moments began to come into focus. Investigators believe the attack started with Clinton. He was stabbed, fatally, possibly without warning. But what came next was nothing short of heroic. Cristen, instead of fleeing, turned instinctively toward her daughters. She pushed them out of sight, made sure they were safe. And then she ran back toward her husband, back toward the killer. In that final act of love and defiance, she confronted him head-on. She fought, and she died doing what she'd always done, protecting her family. When the details reached the media, the entire state grieved. It wasn't just the brutality, it was the unfairness. 2 good people, strangers to violence, ambushed on a hiking trail in broad daylight. Evil had appeared in the most ordinary of places. 4 days later, a major break came. Surveillance footage from nearby homes showed a vehicle matching the suspect's black sedan, taped plate. That led police to a name, Andrew James McGann, age 28. He was arrested quietly at a barbershop in Springdale, just a few miles from where the Brinks had been killed. Witnesses said he seemed calm, almost relieved. He didn't resist. His DNA matched blood found at the crime scene. The manhunt was over. But, as investigators began digging into his life, a new kind of horror began to take shape. Andrew McGann wasn't a career criminal. He wasn't a drifter or a fugitive. He was a former elementary school teacher, someone parents once trusted with their children. But his career had been marked by strange behavior and sudden resignations. Records showed multiple investigations, concerns related to classroom management, professional judgment, and student favoritism. One parent, Sierra Markham, recalled her son mentioning a disturbing comment McGann had allegedly made to a student, "If you were older, I would love to marry you." It wasn't enough to land him in prison, but it was enough to suggest something darker, a fracture in the mind, a growing disconnection from reality. As detectives pieced together his past, they began to wonder, had this really been random? Or had McGann done something like this before? That question was answered sooner than anyone expected. Detectives in Vermont reached out to Arkansas authorities. They had an unsolved case, a 2023 murder in Castleton, Vermont. The victim, Dean Honoree Fleming, a woman shot and killed while walking a rail trail. Witnesses there had described a young man behaving oddly nearby. His description was eerily similar to McGann's. Could the same man responsible for the Devil's Den killings have already taken a life hundreds of miles away? Forensic teams began re-examining old evidence, comparing DNA, retracing McGann's path across state lines. What emerged was the most chilling possibility of all, that the Brinks weren't his first victims, only the ones who finally brought him into the light. McGann pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. But even as the courtroom filled with press and lawyers argued over procedure, one truth hung in the air like a shadow that would never lift. A good family was gone. 2 children would grow up without parents, haunted by memories no child should have to carry. And so, life moved on, slowly, painfully. Today, Devil's Den is open again. The trees have grown thicker, the trails look the same, but the silence feels different. Hikers walk past the same bend where the Brinks once stood, the same spot where laughter turned to screams. There's no plaque, no marker, just a patch of earth that holds a story too heavy for stone. On windy days, the leaves whisper across the trail, and some say the sound feels almost human, like the echo of something unfinished. It's a place that reminds everyone who visits that evil doesn't always wear a warning. It doesn't need a motive. It doesn't need reason or revenge. Sometimes it just needs a moment, and the wrong people in its path. The trial is set for November 14, 2025. This case shattered the illusion of safety in America's quiet corners. It is the story of 2 little girls who lost everything and 2 incredible parents. Clinton and Cristen Brink, who will forever be remembered, not for how they died, but for their bravery in their final moments. Their search for a new beginning ended in the finality of a random encounter, a nightmare that has us all looking over our shoulders in the quietest of places.